We start this month's watching brief with a package of stories that we are lumping together as a snapshot of Britain now outside the European Union and Britain's ability to self express, self actualize policies linked with environmental protection and, by an extension, historical protections as well. And we begin this little package with the news that Wessex Archaeology, the commercial unit, has been announced as Highway England's archaeological specialists for the A303 upgrade near Stonehenge. Uh, Long-time viewers of Watching Brief will not be surprised that we're talking about this, but it's interesting because it's come at a very weird point in the procedure, hasn't it, Andy?
That's right.
Mm,
Uh, the decision as to whether to go ahead with the A303 upgrade running by Stonehenge, which includes digging a tunnel but also landing a dual carriageway across the World Heritage Site,
mm,
is currently with the Transport Minister, who at the time of broadcast is Grant Shapps. Um, and it has already been postponed once. It's due in the course of this month for the final decision. But Wessex Archaeology last week were announced as the not just the preferred bidder, but the actual successful bidder for the archaeological work associated with that, which is a legal requirement under the current planning system, and we'll come on to that later.
hmm
Um, but so, if essentially, Highways England have, uh, they say, to enable them to move as swiftly as possible if they're given permission, but basically, they've preempted the minister's decision. They didn't have to announce it now.
no.
They could have waited for the decision and then announced that they've got a preferred contractor. They
hmm
didn't do that. Now, this is why I think it should be of concern to the archaeological world in the broadest terms,
Mm,
which is that this is a very, very controversial project, even within the archaeological community and heritage community, not just in the wider world. There are many people, for example, who argue that it's an outdated solution to a 20th century problem, that traffic patterns will change, that transport patterns are already changing because of COVID, and the issues around long distance transport and travel are very fluid at the moment.
hmm
Um, Particularly, it's talked to people talk in terms of climate change
mm,
and the amount of carbon, and they
mm,
see it as a very climate unfriendly project. And in fact, a similar massive project, infrastructure project at Heathrow Airport to build a third runway was knocked on the head recently on climate grounds.
yes.
It went to judicial review, and we covered it on Watching Brief that the judge said that the government hadn't taken climatic considerations fully into account as it was required to do.
Well, and it's interesting because in that sense, an underpass near the A303, HS2 itself,
Mm.
um, these all feel like the sorts of projects that for example, I remember as a kid there being intercity toys, train sets, little intercity, um, uh, I think diesel trains, maybe electric as well a little bit, which were very exciting at the time. It was deemed to be, oh, look how industrious this is, look how incredible this solution is. But as you say, these are solutions from a time before I was born, and yet they're still being posited as solutions for what happens next. Do you think though that an element of um, this tendency in civil engineering in this country, and presumably in the near future as well, it's going to continue, is surrounding um, no, sorry, is its impact rather, sorry, in terms of economics, the ability to move huge amounts of funds into civil engineering projects, hiring small private companies and even large private companies to do this sort of work. It's seen as being economically uh, buoyant to do that, and therefore that's one of the reasons why it goes through, even though it may be environmentally questionable, shall we say?
I think the economic argument is really divisive at the moment because there are reports from Whitehall that the Chancellor Rishi Sunak is looking for major savings on government programmes to pay for COVID.
Mm.
So it may yet be that a project like this, and certainly the second phase of HS2,
Mm.
are knocked on the head, at least for the time being, because of the amount of money that cost the Treasury.
Mm.
At a time when, I mean, as we're recording yesterday, the Chancellor, completely out of the blue, announced an extension to the furlough scheme for companies who are at risk because of COVID to pay their staff 80% of their wages from government funds.
Mm.
So,
Well,
massive amounts of money are heading out of Westminster at the moment,
yes.
and some point down the line, the Chancellor will be looking to recoup that. And
Well, no,
so
that's because it's
you
interesting though, because you talk there in terms of cost to the Treasury, um, the Chancellor, so on and so forth. But this is our money, you
indeed,
know,
absolutely. Yeah,
and in that sense,
I'm
it's
using
been,
shorthand.
no, I know, but I think it's
Yeah,
interesting just to point this out in so much as
yeah,
um, people talk about how the Chancellor has been very generous, and you go, well, generous in returning taxpayers' funds to taxpayers, yes,
yes,
and so in that sense, it's interesting how this perception of this being an expense that needs to be paid for sooner rather than later is going to probably gather pace once more. It's often especially a conservative thing to do, to be fiscally responsible by for example, introducing austere economic environments. But it's fascinating to me that this seemingly apparently once in a century event isn't being treated like a world war, for example. You know, we took 50, 60, 70 years to pay off the Second World War. I don't see
yes,
why that can't be done in this instance. But that's a sidetrack, isn't it, I guess, in this
yeah.
conversation.
Can I
Mm-hmm,
make one more point on the archaeological side of this? And it actually is to do with money.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And the headline in the press release that was put out by Highways England and was picked up by the national papers and national media that covered this is that we're talking about 35 million quid for archaeology. Now, in archaeological terms, that's an eye-watering figure.
Yeah. Mm,
35 million quid on one archaeological project, albeit a
mm,
very large one.
mm-hmm.
However, I think
That's around 70 million archaeologists' wages.
exactly you could turn the entire population of the UK into archaeologists and pay
Yeah,
them a decent bung
yeah, yeah.
uh, for at least a short period of time. But no, in all seriousness, and I think two things are going on there, and it's all to do with presentation. And people who've been following Watching Brief will know my obsession with how things are spun, how stories are spun.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I think what we're seeing here is spin from Highways England and Department for Transport, who are backing this project, and it's saying two things. First of all, look, you might think this is damaging to the archaeology of a World Heritage Site, but look, we're spending 35 million quid on it, so it must be all right. And the
So
other
once
one,
again, economic buoyancy. Yeah. Mm,
absolutely.
mm,
The other point is this was put out, I think, at this point before Grant Shapps makes the decision, as part of the preparation to make it look as though the project is unstoppable and is going to go ahead.
yes. Oh,
This is,
so it outlives any new incoming administration, so on and so forth.
and it's positioning in an attempt. It's positioning the project in case Rishi Sunak decides to take his red pencil and put a line across through that particular budget head.
Yeah, it seems too big to fail. Yeah. Mm,
Absolutely, and then we're into the area of what we call the sunk cost fallacy, which was what was brought into play with the London Bridge, Garden Bridge. If you remember, a few years ago, Boris Johnson championed the, as it turned out, unlawful procurement of the Garden Bridge that was due to be built across the Thames at Westminster, and from the South Bank. And one of the reasons that was put forward for that being uncancelable was the amount of public money that had been sunk into it, and the fact that lots of contracts had been awarded with penalty clauses up front.
mm,
And that was done very deliberately to try and make the project uncancelable.
yes.
Um,
Yeah.
the administration then bit the bullet and cancelled it. Sadiq Khan's, the mayor of London, who took over from Boris. This one, I think there are a number of things that archaeologists need to be concerned about here. One is the optics of being associated with such a controversial project and being, I would argue, being used like this to take the project forward, when a lot of people think there are many reasons why the project should at least be put on hold for now. And the other one is interesting. Buried in the press release, there's a paragraph that says, as part of the project, Wessex will also be helping to raise awareness of the importance of the archaeology and landscape by running public archaeology and community engagement programs over the next few years. Local communities and visitors to Stonehenge will have the chance to learn about and engage with the heritage in the area. Now,
And
one has to ask,
the thing is, we've never had that opportunity before to learn about Stonehenge and its environment, have we?
we absolutely haven't, and all the people who know about the landscape and heritage of the Stonehenge area who say this is actually a really damaging project,
Mm,
one wonders if they're going to be covered in that particular outreach program,
mm.
and if that particular outreach program might actually educate the local people who are engaging with it that maybe this kind of project is actually rather more damaging than it's justified.
Mm.
Let's see.
Now
But
that,
as I say,
so
I
go
was
on.
just going to say, I think archaeology needs to be really careful that it's not used in projects like this.
Yeah. Obviously, I say that with tongue firmly in cheek. After all, Stonehenge is English Heritage's second most profitable visitor
Yes.
attraction, I think.
Yes.
But anyway, all of this comes in the context, though, of other things moving in this country. As I say, this is a package really about Britain and its approach to heritage outside the European Union. And October saw the government overturning measures to guarantee UK food standards, for example. Members of Parliament rejected attempts to strengthen post-Brexit fishing protections, and that's actually tremendously ironic, given that one of the main constituents, one of the main benefits touted of Brexit was to regain control of overfishing rights. Um,
Regain control over fishing rights from the large international companies that actually own the fishing rights,
what
particularly ones that are based in the EU in countries like Spain.
precisely,
Yes.
precisely.
Right.
And also, as well, interestingly enough, your favourite member of the cabinet, Jenrick, is it Robert
Honest
Jenrick?
Bob. Yep,
Yeah, Bob
honest,
Jenrick.
Robert Jenrick, honest Bob, as he's known to us.
Uh,
Yeah, yes.
this month said that planning reforms, which are on the table, are a big opportunity to tear down brutalist architecture. Now, as much as we've had back and forth about brutalist architecture in the past, I wouldn't say that it should simply be torn down. Frankly, it's of such a bizarre form and quality that often it falls down on its own anyway. But nonetheless, um,
You mean those wonderful sculptural forms like the National Theatre on the South Bank, just Sir Denis Laston's National Theatre, or
yeah.
the,
Mm. Or
those
the
wonderful Students' Union buildings in Durham?
Oh God, yeah, that woefully inadequate and downright dangerous building to be in any way inebriated within. Um, but it's interesting how, in that sense, you know, Parliament is starting to rattle its sabre with the 80-seat majority for the Conservative Party. They're able to get these things through. Lots of these things, because of the context of COVID as well, haven't been actually reported particularly widely, because an awful lot of people, I think, who consider themselves to be pro-conservative for a myriad of reasons. Maybe for example, if they agree with the need for, say, fox hunting, they're also going to have a sense of living in the landscape and a country lifestyle that's kind of incompatible with some of these food
Well,
standards being
that's
dropped.
really interesting because it brings me on to one of the when we were prepping this, I was thinking about what points were absolutely had to be made here, and
Mm,
you're right. I mean, the issue of resigning from current standards in the environment is is a very live one. The
mm,
government can push through what it wants. The suggestion is that it will do what it wants, particularly to get a trade deal with the United States. Now, as we're recording, a trade deal with the United States of the kind the government seemed to think it was going to get is probably retreating into the distance, if, as seems very likely this afternoon, at 36 minutes past 1 on the 6th of November, Joe Biden is on the edge, just teetering on the edge of being able to step into being president-elect.
mm, mm,
And he is seen as an opponent of Brexit, very pro-European, and potentially very cross with Boris Johnson for things that Boris Johnson said in the past, in particularly in support of Donald Trump.
I was going to ask what happened to that plucky Boris Johnson who suggested the Garden Bridge. Um, no, but you're right, and in that sense, it charts a strange and an even more um, unpredictable course, I would say, for the UK and its legislation protecting, for example, the historic environment, which is connected to broader environmental protections and food standards and so on and
Absolutely.
so forth.
Yeah, exactly. Current system is based on principles laid down in European Union law.
Yeah, yeah. And so, what one will struggle, or one would struggle, I think, to be certain about any particular direction at this point, in so much as it may well be that the pressure from a new administration in the US could mean that actually the government here looks a bit more favourably on an EU transition deal being done by the end of the year. It could mean I mean, it could also mean that, frankly, this government has to do an awful lot of humble pie eating and backside kissing to get a trade deal with the US, which will absolutely impact archaeologists and the historic environment. I suppose finally the last link that we've included in this segment is the latest on the EU Brexit talks by Tony Connolly of RTE. It's a Twitter
Yeah.
thread that you recommended, Andy, and
Mm.
it's a good point of reference because this is someone who is observing Britain as a close neighbour, who is not an Anglophile, who isn't trying to push a certain particular
Yeah.
Brexit narrative, but is nonetheless very interested in what happens, because obviously Ireland will be affected by what happens because they share a land border with Northern Ireland, that is
Yeah.
the Republic of Ireland. So we would recommend maybe reading that as well if people are looking for a bit more context. I suppose to wrap this segment up, what should we be looking out for, and what do you think maybe is the direction of travel for all of these issues? I mean, make no mistake, we're talking about the legislative foundation for example, commercial archaeology linked
Absolutely.
with the planning process. So,
Absolutely.
what should people keep an eye out for, and where do you think we're heading?
Right. I'll try and keep this brief, and it's a very complex area. But at the moment, the short answer is we don't know.
No.
The
Okay, thank you.
government, yeah. No, having said that,
Now the weather.
and now to some singing ducks.
Yeah.
Um, no, um, as Tony Connolly says in that Twitter thread, and I do urge people to look at it and also to follow his work in general. He's one of the most astute commentators on things EU and the negotiations going. There are others. Chris Gray from the University of Essex is another, and there are various other websites and where you can get a more objective, more detailed commentary on what's going on. But essentially, I think the government appears to have put the brakes on, probably because they're waiting to see the result of the presidential election.
Yes.
The suspicion is that a Biden presidency means Johnson will have to make more concessions than he would do under a Trump presidency.
Mm.
As far as archaeology goes, and I'll keep it to that really, I would just refer people to a paragraph in the briefing note that was put out by a combination of Chartered Institute for Archaeologists, the Association of Local Government Archaeology Officers, Council of British Archaeology, and others in the sector, who had a meeting with the Department of Housing, Communities and Local Government, Honest Bob's department. And there are two lines that leap out of it. The document is actually a sensible setting out of a moderate position to maintain archaeology in the planning system. They're not kicking up rough or anything like that, but there are a couple of lines which which leapt out at me. One was the Secretary of State recently proposed that those organisations meet with the community, with the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government to discuss the implications of the proposed reforms on the processes of safeguarding archaeological heritage through the planning system. A date for this meeting has not yet been set. And then in the course of the document, they say, The archaeological sector has adopted a cautiously positive approach to the proposals, recognising that at this stage the lack of information provides an opportunity to ensure policies are developed in a way which is positive for the historic environment. In other words, the Planning for the Future white paper that was put out was very strong on things about making beautiful environments for people to live in, and absolutely thin on safeguards for the not even safeguards, ways to consider the implications for the historic and natural environment. And in fact, other parts of the document talked about speeding up the system and making it more certain for developers. That paragraph continues: we welcome the assurances that we have received to date. However, there remains the potential for archaeology to fall through the cracks if these positive policies are not forthcoming. In other words, this isn't over yet.
No.
And these people who are being very, very reasonable, because they don't want to cut up rough, because they don't want the right wing of the Conservative Party to turn around and say, okay, F you, you're blocking planning and we'll just remove archaeology from the planning system altogether, or it's not funded by developers, you'll have to fund it yourselves. There are other potential ways that the current archaeological system could be absolutely crippled, and we'd be back to the situation we were at in the 1970s and early 1980s, where archaeologists went onto development sites at the behest of out of the kindness of the developer, inches ahead of the JCB bucket, or because there was such a row in the newspapers and the media about the Roman villa that had just turned up on the site in the middle of town. So, the Rose Theatre being the most famous case.
So that could be a direction of travel, but at the very least, there's a crack. There's a possibility that we might be able to stay at the table and keep the conversation moving in a useful direction.
Absolutely, and also let's just say that the current government has a reputation for U-turns.
Yeah. Well, it's one of the benefits of having a leader who wants to be loved by everyone.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
And the final point I make is keep an eye on this. Keep people who care about archaeology, heritage, and the natural environment too, because I think the two things have been divisible in this, and that's ignored all too often. But basically, keep an eye on what's going on. Keep lobbying keep writing to MPs expressing concern that these powers might be watered down, and above all, watch out for the draft legislation if and when it's finally brought forward, because that's when the real row is going to be.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, with that creaky chair, we'll leave it there.